Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves. Hey there, it's Scott Groves with the On the Edge podcast, and I'm here with Erin Freize, which sounds like a superhero or maybe a supervillain name. It's pretty awesome, and that is Erin with an E, I-R-I-N. I almost spelled it wrong 5 times when we were corresponding back and forth, so not the biblical version of Erin, but Erin is a certified financial planner. He is, I don't know what the correct terminology is, but basically has the knowledge and ability to underwrite life insurance. Was introduced to me by a good friend of mine named Mike Merriam, who's probably my favorite person to disagree with politically. And he's like, dude, you have to have Erin on. He makes me look like a dummy. He's just one of the smartest guys I know. So I'm like, hey, what better time than now with, this next stimulus bill coming up, stock market at all-time highs, a little bit of confusion and concern over housing prices and inflation and whatnot. What better time than now to talk to somebody who has a deep understanding of the financial market? So welcome, Erin. Thanks for being on the podcast here in April of 2021.
It is good to be here. I'll have you know that I use the name Mr. Freize everywhere. And everybody replies that that's such a cool name without realizing the pun in that response. So yes, I may be a supervillain to Mike, but I also am a big fan of Captain America. In fact, I wore this over a Captain America suit when I went to vote last November in person.
We would have preferred you wear the Captain America suit in the podcast, but if we have a good conversation, you can wear that on the next one. So let's dig right in, right? Because we're coming out of a year of mass unemployment, COVID, a lot of concerns over the world economy, the national economy, a lot of businesses failing, and somehow the stock market is just on a tear. We're at all-time highs. I think since the market had a small dip in March of last year, we're up like 75% across the board. What is going on that the stock market, which is one of the indicators of financial health, is just blowing away what I think is the lived experience on the ground for a lot of Americans? What is going on right now in the economy?
So I can explain it on a 10,000 foot view. I'll bring it down into the weeds and then we'll come back to the 10,000 foot view. But the bottom line is ultimately the markets, which is an amalgam of a bunch of different companies, are they making money? And the reason the markets are at all-time highs is not just in anticipation of further stimulus, not just in anticipation of an accommodative Fed policy. And we could talk about what those accommodations mean going forward and what the results will be. I think they are very much intended consequences. We'll go into that later. But ultimately, most of the monies that these companies are made, whether you denominate that in dollars or you get more complicated, they're making more than ever. So ultimately, if the market is some type of reflection of earnings and fundamentals, more so than just appetite for risk, I think that explains where the markets are right now. I think fundamentals in a lot of areas are very strong. Now, are there frothy components of the market? Absolutely. And we can go into the details around which components I think are most frothy. But are there companies that are making more money than ever? Yes, more companies than ever are making more money than ever.
Yeah, so that's interesting. It kind of feels like a tale of two cities, right? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. You've got a cross section of Americans that can't work, that can't pay their bills, that are reliant on stimulus. And then you have another cross section of the market that, I feel almost guilty saying this out loud, but super blessed here in Los Angeles, California, where a lot of people are still working. Interest rates have been low. We had an amazing year in the mortgage industry. So I'm one of those assholes who's buying a new Peloton, refinancing the house at the lowest interest rate ever in recorded history, redeploying that money into spending stuff on Amazon and Netflix and Amazon and everything else. So I'm the person that's helping fuel that kind of have economy. What's happening to the people that are in the have-nots? Because if you don't own assets right now, if you don't own a house that's going up in value or stocks and 401ks and bonds that are going up in value, are we leaving the last year like a big cross-section of people behind?
We are. So if we look at the people who need the markets to accelerate, if we look at the people who need a tailwind, those people love lower for longer, right? We need central banks to have rates as close to zero I don't know if I would be very happy as a German parking my money somewhere where I'm essentially paying the bank to have my cash protected, quote unquote. At the same time, if we look at the opposite end, if we look at Ma Pa Freeze, right, who are living on fixed incomes, who are living on their Social Security, if we look at the guy like me whose business was directly impacted by the shutdowns, if we can't go to market right now as entrepreneurs and or we are not considered essential, right? If we're just people whose businesses were shut down, who were told to stay home and stay safe, and we're still not by choice home, especially in places like New York and California, we are being left behind. And we need more than ever government stimulus, which means our own money given to us directly that eventually we have to finance as cheap as possible over the long term. There are huge swaths of the economy that aren't participating in this V-shaped recovery. Eventually, I think whether we're talking central bankers and or we're talking about those who are central planners in our economy, they need to realize that these people are getting really frustrated. And that frustration is going to find its way into political strife, into hopefully some type of mostly peaceful revolution, but we can't continue apace forever. It is unsustainable. And I think most people who are really paying attention would agree with that.
Yeah. You said something in there that I would love for you to define, because I think for a lot of our audience, they don't understand the reference to paying money to have your money in the bank in Germany. So can you talk a little bit about this idea of interest rates being so low that eventually they get to zero and or there's a negative interest rate? Because, the traditional monetary system is I put money in a bank or I buy government bonds or I buy some very safe asset and they give me some type of nominal rate of return. You could, like you mentioned, Ma and Pa Freeze, your parents could live off of CDs back in the day when they were paying 3%, 5%, 6%. They could live off of government bonds when, the 10-year or the 30-year was at 3 or 4%. And now in the US, those are around 1.5%. And some of our savings accounts are a quarter. You mentioned Germany being negative. Can you explain what that means to the listeners that are hearing this for the first time?
So that means that if I am a German and I want my money to be quote unquote safe, what all that really means is I don't want to see my principal go down. I don't want to ride the roller coaster of the markets and own equities, whether you describe that as real estate, whether you describe that as non-traditional equities like precious metals, or whether you describe that as ownership of these companies, whether it's owning the market in an index fund or owning individual companies like a GameStop, right? If I don't want to take that risk, I will take my $100,000, for example, and I will give it to the German government, and they will promise to pay me. And again, you could check this, but I don't know what current market rates are, but let's just say it's negative 0.25%. So I am paying 0.25%. So my capital is safe. It doesn't go up. It's guaranteed to go down by 0.25%. The only reason you do that is because you can't think you do better anywhere else in the world on your quote unquote safe money. Now, there are much, much better alternatives for that. And here in the US, right, it's the opposite of a scenario that we saw in the early 80s, right? Stagflation, right? When we had Jimmy Carter transitioning into Ronald Reagan, I think it was Business Week that said it would be crazy to ever buy a 30-year bond paying you 18% when you can get a CD that's going to give you over the next 2 years 16. How crazy would it be to have 30-year paper paying you 18% guaranteed by whomever, the US government or IBM, right? So they also declared the death of the stock market around about 1981. And again, if you invested for 30 years from 81 to 2011, you probably are a lot happier with your investment over the long term. Now, again, you had 87 through that. You had the tech bubble burst in 01. Well, actually 2000, March of 2000. But on the heels of that, you had 18 months later, 9/11. A lot of people forget that the worst year of that 3-year bear market was actually 2002. And then, of course, you have the Great Recession, right? And we could talk about those numbers, but the peak of the Great Recession was 10-10-7, 10-10-7. And then it was 18 months later, almost exactly, to 399, where we went from 14.2 on the Dow down to roughly 6,500. interestingly, intraday on either March 9th or March 10th, the S&P 500 index got to 666.
Yeah.
So how ominous is that? And then, of course, we had everything that followed from that. So if you invested over that period of time, you would have had a very, very bumpy ride. But if you owned a 30-year bond, you would have only gotten 18% per year.
Well, and I want to talk about this because these numbers might seem just kind of nebulous to somebody who's listening. But to bring this into perspective, I was born in 1979, so the 80s are technically in my lifetime, although obviously I wasn't looking at financial instruments in the 80s when I was a toddler. But it is crazy to me that the financial markets of the world have shifted so much that in the 80s, there was an expectation that you were going to get a CD or a government bond or some type of safe investment vehicle that would pay you in the teens. And the stock market was kind of an afterthought. Maybe it would go up, maybe it would go down. And now that's completely shifted to where you can't retire. You can't even beat inflation because these instruments that used to pay in the teens now pay like in the ones. It's a big deal if the 30-year goes to one or the 10-year goes to 1.75 instead of 1.25. Now that affects mortgage rates on a daily basis, but if you're trying to live off of this money, you don't give a shit about 1.25 versus like 1.75. You've got to make some real return just to beat inflation and keep your money in pace. Exactly. So what happened in the global markets that the expectations have changed now where the growth and income is only in the equities and the stock markets and treasuries, we'll call them, or bonds or any type of fixed rate of return is completely an afterthought. How did the banking industry get away with this idea of paying a fixed rate and the government get away with this from going to paying a fixed rate to now, well, if you want to make decent returns, you got to be all in on risk?
It's the perception of risk. It really is, right? Are we in a risk on world right now or a risk off world? And I'll go into what that means, but let's take a step back and talk about how we got into the opposite scenario. We'll talk about that, but nobody tells you about in 1982 that their mortgage was 19%, right? They brag about the CD that was paying them 15, 16%, but they will never mention the fact that their mortgage was 16, 18, 19%. And that if you go back to watch Wall Street, right? There's a time where Charlie, right, is buying his beautiful brand new condo for him and Daryl Hannah to live in. And the realtor is talking about, I would love to finance this for you. I can get you whatever double-digit rate it was. I would get it to you, but I'm already into 3 other places. And that reminds me directly of 2008, does it not? Right. 2007, right? When every mortgage broker in Florida had 3 different properties, all 3 of which were bought on spec with neg-am loans, right? So now we have a scenario where you can finance capital 30 years later at 3%. Now, relative to inflation, that means that my principal and interest component of my mortgage is going to be cheaper and cheaper because that component is fixed. Everything else goes up. The insurance on my property, the taxes on my property will continue to go up, but the principal and interest component of my mortgage is going to remain the same. So what does that mean? It means that I'm talking to retirees about the crazy notion of instead of using your capital to finance a vacation home or the property you're going to escape to, especially if you're in the frigid Northeast and you want to get where things are a lot friendlier and warmer, well, why wouldn't you buy it now? Buy it today before it's outrageously expensive. Buy it now. Look, be careful. Don't buy on spec. Don't buy sight unseen like properties are going in Florida again, right? So it seems as though we haven't learned those lessons, but finance that capital. If you're a veteran and you can get capital at 0% down and you can finance it at 3% or less, it means that 10 years from now, principal and interest component of your payment is effectively going to be cheaper against everything else that gets more expensive. It means that 20 years from now, it'll be cheaper still. So if you are on a fixed budget, if you have money in the markets, but you don't have to touch it for the next few years because maybe things are going to get less accommodative in the near future. I don't know when. I don't know how the inflection point is going to come, but we know it's coming. We don't know the magnitude of that inflection point, but we know that right now, capital is very cheap. We know that right now, both capital and people are fleeing the frigid north and places like California to find a much warmer and friendlier climate to grow, to live, and maybe to retire. right? So does that help add some real world perspective to that?
Yeah, and I'm just, as I'm thinking, one of the fun political talking points is the, wealth disparity and the income gap and this type of stuff. I'm wondering if really all of this is just a byproduct of these low interest rates, right? Because if you either got lucky or by design or you inherited assets in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now the cost to carry the debt on those assets has gone nowhere but down, it kind of makes sense that the rich would get richer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like and we can talk about Scott Groves here on the ground in LA. If I bought a house that, has only gone up in value because of inflation and I've only refinanced the interest rate down, or if you're talking about Jeff Bezos, who could, build Amazon on a negative income structure where they were losing money for the first 15 years they were around because he could just borrow money so cheaply. I mean, does this explain some of the wealth gap and why the rich are getting richer and the poor who don't own assets that they need to finance are getting poorer?
That's exactly it. It is the perception of risk. So I think that cash is king. Now, first rule of corporate finance is cash is king, right? But why is it king? It's because of what you can earn on your capital. You have to deploy it for cash to be king, to cash work for you. In personal finance, and we could talk about my 3 secrets of becoming wealthy. Happy to chat, to steal my own thunder. There are no secrets. It's things everybody knows. It's things that you've already mentioned right here on this podcast, but we'll go into those in detail later. But the rich are getting richer because they are willing to take risks, not because that they are inherently more risky, but because they understand what risk really means and the different types of risks. There is capital market risk. There is interest rate risk, right? And now in the personal finance world, there is longevity risk. Am I going to last longer than my capital? There is the risk that I might require care, right? I don't want to talk about that scenario where 7 out of 10 people after age 65 aren't going to be able to fend for themselves. They may need help getting out of bed into a wheelchair. We don't want to think about that. But it's a 91% chance that if you have a couple, at least one of them is going to require some expensive care. Hopefully, you die in your sleep at the ripe old age of 100, and none of that happens. But the chances of that happening are getting lower and lower and lower, especially as the cost of care is going up and up and up. So when I talk about the risks that people who own capital and understand equities, think about the richest people you know. Who are the richest people you know, including yourself, including Mike, including a lot of my best clients? They are entrepreneurs. They are people that are willing to take their capital and put it at risk because they're betting on themselves. The reason equities outpace fixed income investments, i.e. bonds, right, and mortgages, is because there is a risk premium. There is a chance you could lose your capital. But if you understand those risks, you know that the risk of your capital fluctuating is higher than the risk of you losing money over full market cycles, right? So how risky was the market way back in March of 2009? The perception was it was higher than ever as the markets were bottoming out. With the benefit of hindsight, we now know we're on the precipice of one of the longest and strongest bull markets ever. And that's during the new normal that they wanted, right?
Yeah.
Do you know where new normal comes from and some of the expression? Muhammad El-Arian from PIMCO and some of the...
No,
so we
no,
know
no.
what new normal means. We may not know the progeny of these terms, but I won't get that complicated. All new normal means is that we need to make sure that people are scared of taking risks and or so scared of not earning money that they're willing to take risks. And that is the difference between 1981, right, and where we find ourselves in 2021.
Yeah.
Right? That 40-year difference is that we have to put our money at risk because right now, government bonds aren't paying anything because the governments can't afford to pay the debt. That's the bottom line. How much money did we owe in 1981 versus right now in 2021? That debt has to be cheap. We have to inflate ourselves out of that debt in order to be able to afford it. Now, one side of the aisle thinks we grow ourselves out of that. The other side of the aisle thinks through central planning, we can keep things cheap enough, long enough, and artificially inflate certain asset classes. Is the answer somewhere in between? I tend to lean more towards growing our way out of it the same way we did in 1981, If we look at the 20 years after 1981, you could argue one of the most prosperous times in this country. Ironically, almost as prosperous as, and some would argue even more so if you look at pockets of it. Ironically, the last time we had rates this low for this long, it was kind of the opposite. It was coming out of World War II. It was the 50s and 60s. Now, in between, we had the 70s to deal with, right? Just as we had maybe a period where the market moved sideways, right? If we look at where we were in 2009, if we looked at where we were in 1981, if we looked at where we were in 1973, 74. So what we need is for people to understand the risks that are out there from a personal financial standpoint, not central banks and what's important to them, but what is important to you, right? How do you get your capital to move for you? And I'm going to tell you, Scott, it's not having cash for as long as possible because it makes you feel good and you feel as though you can deploy that quickly and be nimble. It's good to be nimble, but you got to take those risks. You are a business owner. You are capable to take risks that mom and pa Freize maybe can't. So if we understand that, what does that mean for how you structure your long-term portfolio? And I'm not just talking about your market-based property. I'm talking about real estate. I'm talking about commodities. I'm talking about all of those things, including your earning power and your business that are really going to generate the double-digit returns we need to grow wealthy over time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm thinking about that risk and owning assets and interest rates being so low. It's like there's a temptation by me who made every single financial mistake imaginable in my 20s and early 30s and basically spent all my 30s paying off $1 million in debt that I accumulated leading up to the market crash. You know, I did everything stupid. And now I'm looking at it and I'm like, all right, well, I finally feel financially stable. I have no debt. I've got some cash. Part of me wants to do what the government is doing and be like, well, let's just leverage ourselves to the hilt, buy a second home, buy an investment property, trade on margin, because it's like, you know, if we know that 45% of all the dollars in the United States got printed in the last 18 months, the government, to your point, they're going to keep interest rates low. They're going to try to inflate themselves out of this mess. And the more stuff that I own, meaning houses, gold, stocks, the more stuff that I own, the more wealthy I will get just by leveraging on low interest rates. But just like Venezuela, Greece, you know, running these massive debt cycles are okay until the day it's not. It's the same thing with individual consumers, right? I remember a lot of loan officers in 2008, 2009 who had the 3 properties in Florida and they had invested in the restaurant and the DJ and the mixed martial arts fighter or promotion, you know, just the craziest shit. They're like, well, the money's free. It's super cheap. I'm just going to spread myself thin and invest. You know, they all went bankrupt, right? Every single one of them. So where's that sweet spot of evaluating your risks, taking advantage of the low interest rates, understanding that the government is trying to inflate ourselves out of this problem? Where do we take the risk, one? And then maybe number 2, if you have any opinion on this, where do we start to get in trouble as a country?
Well, so I think we're quickly getting there. I think eventually we have to pay the piper. Now, what is going to prick the bubble, right? What is going to cause it? So I think a lot of people have different opinions about that, but we can't keep borrowing from our future selves indefinitely. We know that's unsustainable. So how do we take the risk? Where do we take the risk? So I think the answer to that question is a really boring one, but the answer to uncertainty is diversification, right? So putting all of your eggs in one basket, like real estate. I'm going to own condos that were $700,000 8 months ago, and they have to be worth $900,000 in 3 months, don't they? Right? I don't think that's the answer for everybody. I think if you look at the capital markets, now again, if we look at the stock market, it's easy to look at these 500 companies that Standard & Poor's feels represents the U.S. stock market and say that's diversified. But if you look within, it's what's called a cap weighted index. So the amount of stock I have as a company out on the market represents how much of that index I own. For example, the FANG stocks. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, it's Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, right?
Well, you missed one. I forget which one. So let's go through it again. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google.
That's right. 2 A's in there.
It's really FANA because Google is no longer Google, right? They're Alphabet.
Right.
They're betting on alpha. And that's an inside joke, but nobody's going to laugh with this nerd. Okay. So you can also include Microsoft and some of the other bigger companies in that name. But if you were to go to finviz.com and you were to look at something like, and you could pull this up right now, finviz.com, and you were looking at a map of the market, you would see that the biggest squares, all those biggest names, the Apples, the Amazons, can we all agree that their market caps have been inflated at least over the last dozen years? That they have had a huge run. Now, think, go ahead.
No, I was going to say inflated is an interesting word, right? Because it's like, well, more than any other company, Google, Amazon, Apple have probably returned more value, had more innovation. So are they higher? Yes. Are they inflated? I don't know. I don't know enough about the technicals to know, is Apple worth what it's currently worth?
So I'll bring it back to PE ratios, right? So all PE means is price over earnings. The price of the stock over the earnings per share of the stock. How much is that company earning relative to the price of the stock? And those ratios are getting really close to where they were when the tech bubble burst in the late 90s. Now, you and I both agree that Amazon is making way more money than they did back then. In fact, we forget when we blame Jeff Bezos and shareholders of Amazon for not paying any taxes, we forget that they lost money for 20 years, right? That they were unprofitable so long. So we have to also focus on that thing. So are they making more money than ever? Yes. But is their PE ratio, are they making enough earnings to support their share price? I think it's close. Are they extremely overvalued? I'm not going to use the term extremely overvalued. I'm not going to say that where there is froth in the market, that's probably where it is. I'm not going to say that. But if we look at the market as a whole, we look at the S&P 500 index, just 500 companies. If one of those smaller companies that barely registers as a blip on that map, their market capitalization is so low that you could have 200 companies have a bad day, but if Apple and Amazon are having a good day, then the market will appear to be up that day. I think as we look back on what happened through the COVID and its recovery, if we look at what artificial restrictions we imposed on the economy, lifting those artificial restrictions is why we had, for the most part, a very V-shaped recovery. Now, it's different depending on where you are and what business you're in. In California, if you're in the mortgage business, you're probably sitting very pretty, right? If you're in California and you're a plumber who only works on restaurants, you're not doing so hot. You probably had to lay off all of your staff. And it's lucky if you, as the business owner, hasn't made a house call in years, is able to go to a restaurant to fix their dishwasher, right? Very, very different. Now, if I'm a mortgage broker in Texas, a little bit different. If I'm a mortgage broker in the lovely state of South Carolina, a little bit different. I'm not going to be selling $600,000-$700,000 mortgages all day. I'm probably selling on volume way more $200,000-$300,000 mortgages, right? And in South Carolina, it's that broken window fallacy, but we know that there is a multiple, right? We know that when a real estate transaction happens, that those homes that have been owned by 70 and 80-year-old widows are going to have to look a lot more like homes for 30 and 40-year-olds that are building a family, right? We know that in that process, there's going to be interior designers. There's going to be a lot of money spent at Home Depot. There's going to be probably a painter or somebody who's putting in some flooring involved, and maybe a broken window or two, right? Now, I don't believe we need to hire an army of people to break windows on Main Street. And maybe when Derek Chauvin is or isn't given the sentence that everybody thinks he deserves, maybe we have some of that on Main Street. But that's kind of a hint of bringing it from,
just in case you lost some people, which you might have. Explain the broken window concept.
So if I want to spur economic growth, a fully intact window isn't going to do much because nothing happens. Now, I'm a movie buff. So do you remember the movie Fifth Element?
Yes.
There is a scene where the bad guy is at his desk and he's explaining to the priest the broken window fallacy. And how does he do it? Well, he takes a glass, breaks it on the floor, and this entire menagerie of machinery sweeps the floor, cleans the floor, and replaces his glass on his desk with a new intact glass. Now that is economic movement, right? So somebody had to build those machines. Somebody had to supply the detergent to clean the floor. Somebody has to get that water from the river up to his glass again, right? Somebody had to pick the cherry that goes into his glass and ultimately chokes him. I don't know if you remember that scene, and then the priest saves his life with the Heimlich maneuver. That is the broken window fallacy, using a glass to illustrate the broken. So does that make more sense? Is that
I've heard it before, expanded upon for the world economy or the national economy, that like, hey, if there's a giant hurricane that wipes out Louisiana, and then there's a massive growth in GDP in the building section or the construction section or the rebuild Louisiana, that grows GDP. It's like, well, yeah, on paper our GDP went up, but are we really happy about Louisiana getting wiped out by a hurricane? So it kind of, when we're only looking at certain numbers like the S&P 500 or GDP, it can be it can mask some other problems that, like, hey, we don't want Louisiana to be wiped out by a hurricane just so we can have growth in GDP because it spurs construction work.
Exactly.
Cool. All right.
Exactly. And what's going to happen is yes, we may have Verizon send trucks down, and those guys are going to make overtime and they're going to spend it locally. Hopefully not at the local cat house. Hopefully they spend it and bring that money back to their families. But, at the same time, we also want to consider that we are merely, not artificially, because some of the damage is organic, but we don't want to create damage just to spur economic growth. We don't want to say that in these city centers, in these very blue cities run by blue people, we don't want to look the other way as somebody over here is breaking the window behind me. Or we don't want to say that it's a mostly peaceful protest as the entire skyline behind us is aflame. Right? So that's where it's a fallacy. That's where we don't want to create artificial destruction, just as on the heels of we have these economic growth zones, these incentives for the government to come in and provide extra money above and beyond what Allstate and Nationwide provides in insurance claims to build it. Because what happens? Well, we borrow more money from ourselves, right? Even though somebody else is administering that money, it's our money. We should have more control about who's spending it and when and on what. But we also have insurance premiums that skyrocket after something like that. And now it's not always the same people paying those premiums. If all of this happens in San Francisco and then the population of San Francisco comes down, well, who's going to repay that? The poor suckers left in San Francisco, just like the lower tax base that they're going to have, right? The premiums are higher. Hopefully the real estate remains sustainable, but less and less people can afford a $800,000 starter home in California, right?
I'm really interested in this because I think the market in Southern California for housing is still extremely strong. And I have some thoughts on this. I'd love to get your feedback. One, the weekend after Santa Monica was on fire because of the protest that we had that turned violent. And by the way, having some friends that live down in Santa Monica, I can tell you the people that were peacefully protesting are not the same people that came out and were violent. So I want to make sure, right. I want to make sure we don't.
I saw it here in Columbia, South Carolina. I saw the same thing. A lot of strangers mulling about downtown, and then things got more violent than I think they thought they would. So we saw it firsthand right here in little old Columbia, South Carolina.
Yeah. So, I want to make sure we don't conflate the two, because I think there was an important protest movement, which is fine. And then I think a lot of bad actors came out at night to fuck around and have some fuckery.
I completely agree.
Okay. So as Santa Monica is burning down that Saturday and there's places being looted and whatnot, it just so happened, I work on Sundays. I work Sunday through Thursday. I had like 5 buyer consults scheduled, back to back to back on Sunday. I was expecting every single one of them to call and cancel and be like, hey, we're taking a step back. The city's on fire. Let's see what happens and how this plays out. I'm not sure if I want to buy a house. Every single one of those 5 were on the call. Could not wait to spend $1 million for a starter home in LA. So I think we're just kind of resilient about this type of stuff as a community, which probably speaks about some sad social commentary, but we'll leave that for another call. And then number two, I think in Southern California, because the prices are so high, we had already self-selected out of a group of people who could afford a house if, you know, the husband was, you know, a shift manager at Applebee's and the wife was a, you know, clerk at a gym. You know, those businesses being closed and those people being negatively income affected over the last year, they weren't going to buy a house in LA anyway, because the price point had kind of excelled to a point where really only, you know, if you have a large down payment or large gift funds for down payment, or you're that working professional on a 150 salary plus, those are really the only people that can afford to buy in a price range where much of California has self-selected into. So I think the housing market is still strong here. But you mentioned places like San Francisco where there was such a concentration of wealth and tech jobs. And now that taxpayer base is starting to find out like, oh, well, if I can work from home the rest of my life, why wouldn't I live in Reno where I can get a $600,000 McMansion? And if I've got to fly into San Francisco once a month for a meeting, so be it. What do you think is going to be the long lasting effect of like COVID being our new normal, people working from home? I mean, do you think larger cities like the one that you and I live in, that they're doomed for a lower tax base and more, you know, flight out to the suburbs or other cities?
I think in a increasingly blue Columbia, South Carolina, which is the capital of the state, which also houses the University of South Carolina, I think it's going to be less challenged than in a Detroit, right, or a Chicago, or a New York City, or even pockets of places like Melville, Long Island, or you know, more of the vacation-oriented places in, say, California or Washington State, right? If that makes sense, if you get what I'm saying there. They have structural problems that even cheap money at 2% for as long as possible isn't going to fix. They have demographic issues. They have obligations that they've made that were more sustainable when those demographics were different 30, 40, 60 years ago. Right. So they have things like pension problems. Does that mean their bonds are going to be worthless? Well, not necessarily, but it also means that when after WW2, when things like pension plans and things like employer provided health coverage was the way they got around salary restrictions, it made sense when you had 12 workers, right, for every retiree. That doesn't exist anymore. So if we're looking at pensions, if we're looking at Social Security, if we're looking at these unsustainable problems that are geographically maybe not as unique as we would like, but it's in the same places that are cold. It's in these economic development centers. It's ironically where we spend the most dollars per pupil on education and get the worst results, right? So are there places where it's cheaper to live, where they don't have some of the same demographic issues? Well, currently, but if enough people move out of California, Washington State, into Texas and South Carolina and Florida, we're going to import a lot of those problems, especially if they continue to vote the same way they did before and not wake up to the realities of these promises that were made years ago when they were sustainable and no longer are.
Yeah, it's interesting because my wife and I have been on a little soul searching, you know, because the last year I haven't met with a single realtor in person. Well, maybe a couple, but the idea that I have to be local anymore as a loan officer is kind of now a fallacy because of what COVID has taught us. And my wife and I were sitting around one night. We were like, hey, you know, we could have been in Cabo this entire last year. As long as I had a stable internet connection, nobody would know the difference. And so we've started to, you know, look around for maybe a second house or someplace we would retire, maybe some place we would move sooner. We've looked at Vegas and Austin and a couple other places. And I was really sad going into Austin because, you know, Austin has effectively adopted all the same policies as Los Angeles. And when I was there 5 or 6 years ago, the city was absolutely beautiful, thriving. You know, wife and I went out there to visit some friends to maybe think about it as a potential spot to land. And I got to tell you, the Riverwalk downtown by Austin is now 5/10 deep of homeless people. All the green belts throughout Austin are, you know, they look like shanty towns. I was really disappointed. And there's a big pushback now from more of the rural areas, and I would say more of the kind of conservative residents of Austin. You know, they've got a couple, because I got a lot of friends that live in Austin, they've got a couple ballot measures to, you know, end the public camping and do some other stuff to start policing the city because, you know, I mean, Austin and downtown Los Angeles and certain other major metropolitan areas, it looks like a scene out of Blade Runner. And, you know, it's just like some dystopian future where I just can't even believe it. And it's weird to me that smart people, especially here in LA, can't look around and they can't connect the fact that, like, maybe the policies and the people we're voting for are leading to some of these outcomes. Now, I'm not saying we're going to completely eradicate homelessness by going back to a more, you know, conservative mindset on government spending and government policy, but it's got to be a piece of the puzzle, I would think.
Well, just like Jesus said, and I don't want to get religious here, but Jesus said, we'll always have the poor, right? So to add measures that seem compassionate to try to help wealth inequality by letting people live in tents by the river. Chris Farley made jokes about that, except it was a van years ago. The goal is not to live in a van by the river anymore, right? The goal is to find a way to give that person some purpose in life so that they can afford to move out of the tent, maybe into a van or an RV and get more mobile and get some type of way that they can add to the economy, right? That they can add to however micro, meaning that individual person, their family, their community, their city, their state, and so on and so forth. As we have more and more central planning coming down on these people, they realize that we are artificially creating problems. And we are exacerbating the problems the more we dig our hands into it instead of letting the invisible hand do its magic.
Can you talk about that? Because I think some people hear that, you know, invisible hand of the economy, which tends to be a more conservative talking point versus central planning, and obviously more progressive people don't like to call it central planning because that harkens back to Russia and the failures there, which is exactly what happens in central planning. Can you talk a little bit from an economic standpoint of what are those theories, the theories of kind of the invisible hand nudging things versus central planning? Because I think we all know how this works out if you're a student of history, but what are those two differences?
Right. So we have the Enlightenment philosophers like Locke, like Comte, right? We had people who looked at society and said, okay, we can have our feudal lords dictate what's best for the serfs and everybody else. And we trust that they have blood and generations of wisdom that they've inherited. So they are in the best position to make those decisions. Or we can let individuals make choices for themselves in their best interests. And we have a great mass of people pursuing their own best self-interest. It sounds selfish, and it is, but if everybody is pursuing their own self-interests instead of dictating what is in the best interest of someone else, i.e. stay home, stay safe, right? If we allow individuals to make those decisions and arm them with the tools to realize and educate them, let them know that they are human and therefore they will fail. It's okay to fail. We have to let people fail. And like you did, learn from your mistakes. Don't make them over again. Except central planners are exempt from any failure, right? They cannot admit, right? It's just like Child 44, a movie about Stalinist Russia. There is no such thing as murder right here in paradise, right? Nobody dies in paradise, but who is doing the murdering? Stalin. So, right? So we have to realize that individuals are both capable and flawed, and that's okay. We have to entrust people to make their own decisions and make mistakes. And if enough people pursue their own self-interest and rely on them they are flawed, but they also have good tendencies. They don't want to harm their neighbor, right? Do no harm, right? Get an artificial entity out of the way of people interacting with one another, and you'll get better results en masse.
So,
Is
just to
that
play,
kind of how you understand it?
yeah, absolutely. And just to play a devil's advocate and push back, the quick response, and I think one that's valid, is usually from the environmentalists that say, well, if you just let everybody work in their best interest and you have no control and no central planning, then, pick any evil oil company you want, dumps all their sludge into the Mississippi River or Lake Michigan, and then they ruin everything. They ruin all the long-term benefit because all they care about is immediate short-term gain. And I think there's some flaws in that argument as well. But, I think that's a rational, reasonable criticism that if everybody's working in their own self-interest and there's no central planning, then it kind of all runs amok and we destroy the environment and we have, 1950s industrial revolution where people are
Chaos.
just chaos, absolute chaos, right? So why does
Right.
that not happen? Or maybe why does that not matter? Maybe that's just an outcome. I don't know. When somebody makes a reasonable argument like that, what's your thought?
Well, let's think about where we are and let's think about things like conscious capitalism. Let's talk about the CEO of Whole Foods and how he describes you can't just look at shareholders, right? And that's very much the Great Reset is saying, well, shareholders only care about the size of their portfolio. Well, no, if they're a good business owner, they care about other stakeholders. There are plenty, not just the shareholders. The shareholders are important, the people who own the company, but you also have management, the people that run the company, the employees, the people that hopefully are. I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about the area where I grew up in Binghamton, New York. So where I grew up, we had entire communities. There was a company called Endicott Johnson, and they manufactured boots. So you might imagine in the 40s they were doing really really well, and then after they decided that an entire community built from EJ homes, right, was they decided that we can't let these companies deal with low taxes. We can't have all of these people that are hired by and employed by the same company. But I look back on an entire neighborhoods built by this one company, and they built parks, they built pools, they built golf courses, and they built lives for their employees that were sustainable and very happy. They did very well. They didn't need necessarily a government imposed healthcare system because they were generally very happy and healthy. Now, did they get care from the local doctor? Yeah, but back then you could take your family of five, go to the doctor, and give the doctor a $20 bill, and you're good for the day. We'll see you next year, Roger. That's my grandfather's name. But that's what healthcare was before. And guess what? The doctor knew the name of your kids back then. And it wasn't show up with my barely look at you, show up into the office with my little checklist. Okay, you're feeling pain here, there, that, and then move on to the next person. That wasn't what healthcare was back then, before managed care. So if we look at all stakeholders, employees included, right? If we look at suppliers to that, and yes, the community itself, very much EJ communities all over again. If we look at the environment, and now again, as a conservative, I understand what conservation really means. I understand the sickness I see when somebody throws their cigarette butt and or the McDonald's trash on the highway. That pains me quite a bit. So we don't want dirty rivers. We want to breathe clean air. The fact that Republicans or conservatives want dirty air and unclean rivers is just one of the biggest fallacies out there. It's just nonsense. We live in those communities. Now, if you have somebody who doesn't live in your community telling you how your community should live, then you have the neighborhoods in and around Detroit and Chicago and New York City and so on and so forth. So I don't know if that describes the difference of conscious capitalism to a complete laissez-faire, but we do not have that today. We have massive, huge corporations that dictate what is best for the corporation and the shareholders, but the best corporations and the ones that will be sustainable over the long term look at all stakeholders, not just shareholders, right? And they understand that they are very much within these communities. So you can have an AOC saying, no, we can't offer any tax breaks to have Amazon move a headquarters here. Or you can have the people who ran Binghamton when we had cigar manufacturing. Yeah, upstate New York, who'd have thunk it? Cigar manufacturing. We had IBM, right? We had Mr. Watson create IBM. We had Singer Link. We had a burgeoning Lockheed Martin before they took the the contract away from Lockheed Martin for Air Force Two, the helicopter, and Obama decided his friends at Sikorsky should get the contract instead, right? So that is not capitalism, right? That is not laissez-faire. That is very different from the thrust of what was the invisible hand. So hopefully that answers some of those questions.
Yeah, and you mentioned you tied the invisible hand to basically everybody working in their own self-interest. And, you know, one of my favorite books is Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. It's a long book, but it's very easy to read, and I'm a big fan. And he talks about relating this idea of working in my own best interest and how that immediately signals price back to the market. Because if I'm working in my own best interest and I decide that this microphone is worth $300, then I'll pay $300 for it. But for a central planner to come in and say, no, it's worth 30 or it's worth 3,000, you know, you can just see where this runs amok real fast. And for some reason, this seems to be more the direction the U.S. is moving to. We want more and more central planning. We want more and more of our life to look like the post office and the DMV. And that just really kind of scares me.
In general.
It kind of scares me.
Yeah. So,
and I don't know why this is. Like, I don't know why. I don't know why the nation is moving in this direction where we want more and more central planning and more what I would call the nanny state in all areas.
I know why, Scott. I know just like Thomas Sowell, you must be a racist.
God, here we go. Yeah, by the way, for those that don't know what Erin's talking about, Thomas Sowell is a black man. He's been one of the premier educators at Stanford University for 30 years, but he's also a very conservative, economic, brilliant, just one of the most brilliant men. I think he's like one of the greatest gifts America's ever produced. But every time he talks about some conservative economic policy, he gets called racist, and then people find out he's black, and it's quite hilarious. So that's where the joke comes from Erin.
Thank you for explaining my joke for me.
Yeah, no problem, because that's all I need is that to be the part that gets screenshot by all my realtors. Scott's racist. It's like, no, this is a joke pertaining to you get the joke.
Yeah. That's the important part. And I know enough of your listeners and the people who watch this are going to get that joke as well. So I think part of the reason we want to move toward, when I say we, Americans in general want to move towards more central planning is because of this push towards democratic socialism, which is just socialism as sold by Democrats. I mean, that's as simple an explanation as you will ever get, certainly from Bernie or AOC, but I think a lot of people would do well to read Thomas Sowell instead of getting maybe an economics degree from Boston University. And yes, that is a dig at one of our newest congresswomen. So she did get reelected though. So she's doing
something right.
Not that. Yeah. So. I honestly, to be quite frank, I like the fact that she is calling out her own party on some of the stuff that is unsustainable. When the Democratic Party becomes war hawks, we know we live in a very different world than we did in the 80s. When you and I grew up, 80s and 90s were a much different period. So, when we have a president who hasn't started a war, and it's the first president to do that, I don't know how far we have to go back, at least to WW2, but we had a president who for 4 years didn't start a new war and pulled more troops out. I think that was progress, but obviously our friends who voted for Joe and Harris don't agree.
So what's interesting is I couldn't bring myself to vote for Trump, but I definitely wasn't going to vote for Biden. So I quote unquote wasted my vote again, voting for the libertarian candidate. But what's interesting to me is this is a perfect example of the just unfettered hate for Donald Trump, that he was so hated that he basically did the things that Democrats have been asking for since the Vietnam War, which is the president should start no wars. He should use no executive action to put new soldiers into new places. He should draw down troops from other locations. He should do everything he can to encourage public policy that deters warmongering, aka the peace deals that we struck in the Middle East. Like, you can hate Trump for everything. You can think he's a disgusting human being because he was hot mic saying grab him by the pussy. You can disagree with every one of his international and local policies, and you can hate everything about him. But if you are an anti-war voter, AKA mostly Democrats, mostly progressives, you have to give the devil their due and be like, Trump did all the things that, you know, Biden and Obama and Clinton and everybody else said they were going to do. Like, he didn't start any new wars. He didn't bomb an aspirin factory because he got a blowjob in the White House. Clinton reference, of course. But it's just crazy to me that there was so much hate of him that, like, now, to your point, Democrats are like the war hawks, where they're like, well, if he was peaceful, we got to start some shit somewhere. It blows my mind.
I know. I guess drone strikes are more a sign of compassion than pulling troops out of an area where maybe they don't belong for the last couple decades. I don't know. That's more the libertarian side of me. I don't believe in foreign entanglements. Having said that, I also very much believe and would support a Tony Stark character who finally wakes up and realizes that there is peace through strength. And I have people I love dearly that work at Lockheed Martin, and I'm glad Lockheed Martin is doing really well. I'm a little concerned that the new CEO of Lockheed Martin is the former CEO of American Tower. Do you know who they are?
No, I'm not familiar with them.
They are a real estate investment trust that owns, manages, and builds 5G towers. So I'm not going to go down that path today.
Oh, that's some big time conspiracy theory now.
So he was picked over people that were groomed for years and years and years within Lockheed Martin. So I find that interesting. So it's either probably a really promising new technology, just like blockchain, or it's something maybe we should keep our eye on.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because,
and I say porque no leftos.
We could go some crazy directions here, but the bottom line is, it's been a pretty good year or two for conspiracy theorists. You know, if you would have told me 5 years ago, if you would have told me 5 years ago, there was a guy who was very, very close to all major politicians of the last 30 years. Yeah, exactly. And he was running sex trafficking for young girls out of Florida and had a private island where there was sex with minors going on. And then he would be arrested and found dead in his cell under mysterious circumstances. If you would have told me that 5 years ago, I'd been like, yeah, that's a great Tom Clancy novel, but that's not happening in real life. So it's been a pretty good run for conspiracy theorists recently. So feel
2020 banner year for conspiracy theorists. Absolutely.
Banner year.
So let's take it back and so we've had former presidents who said the exact same thing. Now they may say it behind closed doors, and the supporters of Clinton and Kennedy would agree. And Hollywood has run by a system where it's not that you grab people by the you-know-what, right? But they let you, they, meaning attractive women, let powerful rich men grab them by the pussy, is a reality, unfortunately, that goes back millennia. He happened to mention it in a locker room type of conversation with Billy Bush. And suddenly, just like there are good people on both sides, just like making fun of a New York Times reporter when he was never making fun of a New York Times, he gives this gesture when he's saying he's flustered. When he himself is being flustered, he'll do this gesture. Just like good people on both sides. He specifically said, not the neo-Nazis. And yet there is one narrative that is spread among all, and that's the one that we have to buy. Just like democratic socialism is the savior for all of society's ills.
Yeah, I don't know.
You just got really serious, Scott. Some of that was meant for smiles. But.
No. I know. It's so weird to me because I understand why Trump is an easy to hate guy, and you know, a lot of the claims about him are, I think, in some ways true. Do I think Trump is racist, homophobic, pick any of your, derogatory terms? No, I just think he's a pure narcissist. And I think that anybody who can't help him further his goals is just completely ignored. So here's how I picture Trump. I picture Trump is at Mar-a-Lago doing some meet and greet, shake hands, and he runs into Dave Rubin, who's a podcaster who happens to be gay. Trump knows he's gay, but also knows he's very influential. So Trump is going to be overly nice to Dave Rubin and his husband because Trump is such a narcissist and he's so good at reading the situation on who can help him that he'll be extremely nice to that homosexual couple. And 20 minutes later, as he's walking out, maybe he meets a less influential homosexual couple and just completely looks over them, doesn't acknowledge them, doesn't talk to them. And then the narrative is like, well, he's homophobic. No, I don't think he's homophobic. I just think he's so narcissistic that he's only going to talk to and value people who can further his goals. That's my read on Trump. And I just think other politicians are better at playing that game. But whatever, I'm sick of talking about Trump. We had 4 years of nonstop
Scott,
Trump.
I'm just going to say, if it's you or me, now we would rather listen to, we would have a good time, more likely with Dave Rubin and his husband than we would with the guy who is the face of Vox, right? So if both couples come at us and are starting a conversation in one of these very visible locations, well, I'm going to hang out with the guy that I think is going to be more entertaining and less with the guy I disagree with, which doesn't mean I won't engage with somebody who maybe comes from a different side of the aisle. Entire epic conversations on Mike Merriam's back porch, come of that. We've had great engagements there, and the neighbors may not appreciate it at 4 a.m, but we have a great time talking about those things.
Let's talk about this because I think there's an interesting dynamic developing where, I live here obviously in Los Angeles. The realtor community that I work with, I would say on average, 70 to 90% of the realtors that I work with probably have a much different political philosophy than I do. Some of them are extreme progressives, which frankly, I don't understand how you can be an extreme progressive and work in the most capitalistic job in the world, AKA real estate in Southern California, where your job is to get the highest priced for your seller. So that's always a weird, that's just always weird to me, but I digress. And what I have noticed over the last, call it 10 years, call it the rhetoric of Trump, call it the divisiveness of some of the Obama policies and some of the ways that Republican reacted to them. I feel like I disagree with a lot of people that are on the other side of the political spectrum. I feel like a lot of people who even I would have used to consider friends on the opposite side of the political spectrum think that I'm evil. And I don't know why this dynamic is developing where I'm kind of shocked. I'm kind of shocked to say out loud that, if I'm looking on whole, because I'm sitting here as a libertarian, obviously leaning a little bit more right, but kind of can evaluate things, I think, a little bit more openly. And I'm starting to see where my more conservative friends are opinionated, but will have a conversation, and my more progressive friends are opinionated and think everybody else is evil. And I don't know why that dynamic is developing, or maybe I'm just, in a unique situation in Southern California where if I was in, Northern Texas, that's how conservatives look at progressives. Maybe it's just a byproduct of the echo chamber that I'm in, but I don't know. You're in South Carolina, which is a much different demographic. Are you seeing the same thing where more conservative people disagree, but will have a conversation, and more progressive left-leaning people just think if you disagree, you're evil?
I think that's a big part of why I moved from New York to South Carolina, is because you can say unironically to somebody, well, bless you as you're parting ways. And, I hope you have a blessed day, things like that. But you can also disagree with somebody and you're not evil. Just by virtue of whomever you voted for in the last election doesn't mean that you're an evil person. I think that's on both sides. I think far more you'll have a conservative who is willing to have a conversation. Now, you may get heated in that conversation, but hopefully you know and love that person well enough where, just like a family member, it can get really heated, but then you hug it out and you agree that, you know what, you're the same person I knew 20 years ago. I think the difference is because they have been told to demonize people with whom they disagree with, you see it far more on the left than you do on the right. That's my experience. It's my experience in social media, especially. I think social media is dividing us. I think when people have the protection of their safe space at home and they're able to speak, if you look at my engagements with people on social media, I don't call them libtards, right? I don't bring stuff like that up, but I am evil. I'm a misogynist. I'm a racist, and so on and so forth, just because I may actually like something that Trump said that day.
Right.
Right. Or I may think that Ben Carson is a brilliant man. I mean, I don't understand that, but I think where it comes from, and I think we have a path to fixing this. I think where it comes from is the epic amount of gaslighting that people who are very, very intelligent are forced to swallow. So when they are told that young kids are as susceptible as a 78-year-old, which just happens to be life expectancy, to something like this virus that came out of Hunan, when they are told they are equally susceptible, and then their teachers believe it and aren't willing to go back to school, I think that frustrates people because they know better. Yeah. I think when they're told that this guy, this orange man, is bad, and yet he's the same playboy from 1992 that we all knew and most rappers loved, when they tell us that he's racist, yeah, I don't know, because I saw him hug it out with Mike Tyson and, unfortunately, Don King, right? When we have to swallow that, when we're told that they are mostly peaceful protests, that doesn't mean that there aren't flames behind them. It means that most of the people who showed up are there to protest an injustice. But then to say that Antifa is an idea, and these foreigners that just happen to be in both Binghamton, New York, and Rochester and Buffalo, burning the local parks down, I don't know. There is something more than an idea there that's destroying these communities when they are not able to recognize these things that they see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears. I think it angers them.
Yeah.
And the best place that they can put that anger are the people that they know and love best. So that's why they're willing to scapegoat their friends and family. And I think eventually we're going to have a very Goodwill Hunting moment where we get to be Robin Williams and we get to approach them and say, listen, these tweets, right? It's not your fault. It's not your fault. We understand what happened here. And it's not your fault anymore. I get it. I'm willing to look past this because I know you and I love who you are as a human. You love me too. So it's not your fault. And we need to embrace them and hug them and get them to realize the same way that they, now in a very different way, they may think a very Southern thought like, oh, bless your heart. And you know, it means anything but bless your, it's saying, well, you don't know any better.
Right.
It's not their fault, right? They were told to accept a lot of things that weren't true. They have to believe it because challenging those beliefs is challenging who they are. We are guilty of the same thing in many ways, but I think we see it better because maybe because we're on the right, we're libertarian. We've always been the other side of what is popular. We've been the other side of what Hollywood and education and the popular press has been demonized. So we've lived with it for 20, 30 years now. So we're okay with it. The fact that it was ramped up to an unprecedented level last year means, okay, we know why they're doing it. We know that absent the response to COVID. Now, again, was it very real? Was it very dangerous? Absolutely. Right. But I'm going to borrow from Yogi Berra, and I say this to everybody, and I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, you will nod when you hear 90% of the response to COVID was at least half political.
Right.
Right. Just like he said, 90% of baseball is half mental. 90% of the response to COVID was at least half political.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
You mentioned the thing of like having that Goodwill Hunting moment where it's like, hey, I'm not mad at you. It's not your fault. You were encouraged into doing this. I've got a realtor. This will blow your mind. I know a realtor who I've worked with on and off for, I don't know, 12 years. We're currently not talking. She knew my serious girlfriend I had. She saw me at least with my serious girlfriend who I had in my late 20s who was black. She knew and had met my ex-wife who was Indian. And she knows that my current wife, my second wife, who will hopefully be my forever wife if she puts up with me, is Mexican. And this person knows that I have 3 mixed race children. However, in the heat of an argument that she disagreed with a year ago on COVID, her and a couple of her friends who also disagree with me started calling me a racist on Facebook in an argument. And I'm like, you can call me a lot of things. You can call me a college dropout. You can call me an obese fat fuck. You can call me an idiot. You can call me a horrible loan officer. But for you to go there, to call me a racist when you know these things about me and my personal life, and you know that several of my top referral sources happen to be black and or gay and or whatever, and to start making the racist, homophobic arguments because that's just the go-to, I'm going to shut down somebody's conversation by calling them a racist. To me, it was the most horrific thing somebody could say to me. And I'm not saying I'm infallible. Right. I'm not saying in the Army I probably didn't say some horrible things or make some off-color jokes, just like I think everybody else I've ever known. But to say that I'm racist in any way, I was so angry. And I've really thought to myself, when this COVID passes and things open up and I run into those 3 or 4 realtors, half male, half female, am I going to drill them in the face with a left hook, which I think is totally justified? Or am I just going to laugh it off and be like, hey, man, I'm sure you were just having a bad day. You know that's not me. I know that's not you. Let's move on. And frankly, I think both would be justified. A left hook to the face or because, I mean, I just can't think of a more horrible thing to say in a public space about somebody you work with professionally who counts on referrals for business. And I remember looking at that and I was distraught for like 2 days because I'm like, I know you don't know that about me. And to use that kind of language to score some political points on a Facebook argument, like, how dare you? And it blows my mind. It blows my mind that that's the norm.
Well, and that comes from being told it's okay to punch a Nazi, but everybody that disagrees with you is a Nazi. So they are more than willing to throw that left hook, right? And we have to turn the other cheek. You know, we, as I don't want to say we're bigger people, but we've been through this before. All right, everybody who has my opinions is a bad guy. Let me try to explain why maybe I'm not a bad guy. You know I'm not a bad guy, but let me rationalize my point of view. And then when you do, and they know it's a rational statement, then they have to come out swinging. And because that's their defense mechanism. So we have to do a better job, right, of accepting, moving on, and then realizing at some point it will get better. At some point they will just organically see what we all see. And I don't care if that's the person who's in the White House, right? His female successor in the White House, probably before we have another election. Who knows? It's everything having to do with this disease that was dangerous, but was it the same as Spanish flu? Well, no, for a lot of reasons it wasn't. And to try to portray it as the end of humanity as we know it, unless you do all the things we tell you to do, I think was just despicable. And it goes on to other political realms and other things. The fact that I am going to leave that alone. We'll come back to another one another time, but it has to do with, let's just say, having our daughters go to bathrooms where we hope they're the only women in the bathroom. But
yeah, let's
leave that alone.
Let's circle back around. Let's circle back around to your three ways to get wealthy. Let's get back to the financial conversation. In this market, because you mentioned it, where whether it's gold or property or equities or pork bellies or collector watches, it doesn't matter what asset class you're looking at.
Good segue, Scott. Thanks for saving me from myself.
No, it's fine. You used Rolexes all the way up to the stock market. Everything feels very frothy and expensive and in some ways overvalued. So even in this market, what are the 3 strategies to get wealthy with Erin Freize?
So rule number 1 is a cliche that we've heard so many times that we're sick of hearing it. Learn to live on less than what you make, right? We also know that is pay yourself first, but if you are never in a position to live on less than what you make, you will never be financially independent, right? So, and that's where Susie Orman and Dave Ramsey, Finance 101, Personal Finance 101, learn to live on less than what you make. Okay. So save until it hurts. The more you save, the earlier you save, and the more abundantly you save, the quicker you'll become financially independent, right? Think about the person who has, from the time they were flipping burgers to the time they started making real money in the mortgage markets. Imagine that person has always saved half of their income. Well, if you right now could half of what you can afford a place in, right? Afford a place in Murray in South Carolina, your permanent resident, and maybe you afford a getaway chateau. It's where it's fun to go, right? Learn to live on less than what you make. That's rule number one. You've heard that one before, obviously.
Absolutely. And I've got a funny story about that. I remember when very early on, when I first started doing loans, I took a loan for a guy who is shift manager, maybe a store manager at Jack in a Box. And I've got to tell you, I in my 20s, working at a bank and wearing a suit to work every day is maybe somebody I would have looked down on. And when I looked at his 401k and he had $1 million in his Jack in a Box 401k because he started there 20 years ago flipping burgers, maxing out his 401k, and 22, 23 years later, this was probably in the mid 2000s. So he had survived the bubbles and he had ran it up. When I saw that guy and I was like, oh, this guy's buying a house. He's changing the financial direction of his family, and he's got $1 million in retirement. And he's probably got another 10, 15 years to work, and it's not glamorous, and it's working at fucking Jack in a Box, but he's crushing it just from compound interest. So that really changed my opinion on how much wealth you can accumulate if you save from an early age. So sorry, that's my little anecdotal story, and I'll probably tell that story 100 more times on this podcast because it really stuck with me in my 20s. And then I didn't learn from it, and I didn't do anything until my 30s. So whoops. But anyway, okay. So live below your means, pay yourself first, save till it hurts. What's number two?
Okay. So again, that guy who's got $1 million in his 401k and he's not done working is probably in a better position that owns $1 million of personally owned real estate, right, where they live. He's in a better position. So if you learn to live on less than what you make, rule number two, do something smart with the difference. So what does that mean? It means early on, get to be that guy who has $1,000 in their savings account, which you and I both know most Americans can't do. We are bred to be famous consumers, right? We can buy things with the best of them because that's what we're trained. We're inundated every day. Buy this, buy that. It's on our phones. It's on our TVs. Every screen is helping you become a better and better consumer. But no, you have to be a better and better saver and then do something smart with the difference. So eventually, after you've developed the discipline to have $1,000 in your account, next step is, again, I don't know if this is rule number 3 or 4 or what is, but Dave tells us have enough for an adequate emergency and opportunity fund, right? So too many people see that as the rainy day fund, but it is also your opportunity capital. Have a fund that regardless of the next paycheck, you can dip into it. For some people, depending on their business, is only a month or two. For some people, they may want 12 months of liquidity that they can tap like that, right? And so after that, make sure you are putting at least as much into your retirement plan as your employer is matching. That's probably rule 14, but it's Dave Ramsey tells us to do the same thing. If you are eligible, which is most people who are starting out, not somebody who's at your level now, but if you're eligible, max out, get to the point where you're putting $50 and then $100 and then $500 a month into a Roth IRA, right? That's a very smart place to put capital because they will change the rules. Roth 401ks are newer and they're not as juicy because one, it has to be a distribution from an employer plan. Not every employer plan is going to allow in-service distributions. Two, if you can get a distribution from a Roth 401k, the distribution is not all a return of your basis or your contributions cumulatively. What you get out of a Roth 401k is part interest and part principal, right? So there's going to be a gain component that's going to be taxable. Roth IRA isn't the same way. If you've been putting, and I'm going to use a round number, $5,000 a year into your Roth IRA, And if it's worth $120,000 10 years out, well, you've got 50 grand you can tap into without any penalties, right? Without any taxes. So that's a double-edged sword. It is more available and more liquid than other types of retirement plans. But that's one of the reasons we want to put money into a Roth IRA. When they changed the rules, the service, the IRS, often grandfathers existing plans. So if you haven't opened one yet and you're eligible, and off the top of my head, I think you have to be married filing jointly under $196,000 of adjusted gross income, right? If you fall below that threshold, whether it's just for 1 year because of COVID, or you haven't filed your return, and we're sitting in 2021 and we have until May 17th to make a contribution, we'll go ahead and try to source enough as much as possible, ideally from your opportunity fund. And maybe in previous years, you made too much, you weren't eligible. If you're eligible for 2020 and you haven't filed yet, go ahead and make a contribution as big as you can. Get your Roth IRA grandfathered before they change the rules on us. Because again, the Roth 401k is newer than the Roth IRA, which came out in the late 90s. The Pension Protection Act of 2006 gave us the Roth 401k. And again, they're not as juicy as the Roth IRA. You better believe that just like a Roth 401k, they will mandate distributions from a Roth IRA. Well, what do I care if I'm paying taxes? Well, if they can mandate distributions, they will probably institute rules that will mandate how much you can take per year that's still going to be tax-free.
Got it.
Right? Right now, it's unlimited. You can put your $50,000 away over 10 years, be ineligible for the rest of your life. Let that pocket of $120,000 grow to be $1 million, right? And every dime you take out of it, as long as it's after age 59 and a half, is going to be a qualified distribution and completely tax-free. I could see them changing that down the road to make them less juicy. All right. So what else can you do? Again, contribute to your employer's retirement plan, at least up into the match, then go back and maximize your Roth IRA. But set up what I call a fund. Now, this is beyond your rainy day and opportunity fund. You can set up a pool of money called a non-qualified account. You ever heard that term before?
Yes.
So all that means is the nature of the investment is going to dictate the taxes that you pay. So when I talk about non-qualified, I'm taking out of the realm of IRA and qualified employer-sponsored retirement plan like a 401k, 403b, 457. So if we have a non-qualified plan, now there are no rules around how much I can stick in it every year. I'm not limited to $6,000 like the Roth. I'm not limited to whatever it is, 19 or 26,000 into a 401k. I also don't have income limits. Like I said before, the AGI limit for a Roth IRA contribution. Well, now you don't have to worry about that. You can make $1.2 million and put money in this account as much as you want, as little as you want. You also don't have age restrictions like 59 and a half before the money I take out is deemed qualified. You don't have age 72, used to be 70 and a half before the Secure Act, which was passed before the CARES Act last year. The Secure Act meant that now if I have qualified retirement dollars that I've never paid tax on, like most people deferring salary into a 401k, eventually you got to pay the piper. Do you think that tax bill is going to be greater today under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, aka those evil Trump tax cuts? Or do you think taxes are going to be higher when we got to pay off this now $30 trillion worth of debt?
Yeah,
I think tax rates are going to have to go up.
This is one of the great scams, right? Because, well, I feel like it's a scam. Maybe it was an accident. When I got my Series 7, when I was at Washington Mutual for 8 years, where they wanted you to be able to do loans and investments and annuities and open new accounts. So I got my Series 7. I started the CFP series that you completed to get your certified financial planner. And all of the marketing was about have your 401k, have your IRA now, where you put money away when your taxes are higher because you're working and presumably earning more money, and then take it out in 20 or 30 years when taxes are lower. But what's starting to develop is there's never going to be a time period 20 or 30 years from now where taxes are lower. So great, you're deferring, money now at a 20, 25, 30% tax rate, only to have it grow and then take it out in the future at a, 25, 30, 35, 40, for some people, 50% tax rate.
33, 40 cents. Right.
Yeah. So
especially in California.
Yeah, in California, we're up to the point where, unless you're on a, LLC or you're self-employed where you can write everything off, if you're just a W-2 employee making over 200, 250 grand, they're going to get 35% of your income. And goodness forbid you go over 500 grand in income on a W-2. They're going to find a way between the federal and the state and all the fees and all the other overhead. They're going to find a way to get 50 cents on the dollar, which is pretty crazy to me. But anyway, that's a whole different conversation. So rule number one was, spend less than you make. Rule number two is do something smart with the difference. Our IRA plans, and then your non-qualified plans, which is just investing, stock market, mutual fund, whatever. And then what's rule number three?
Correct. So, and there's a lot more smart things to do. That's where you get into real estate. Whether you're starting out, maybe it's in your Roth IRA, you do a real estate investment trust, because they're doing all the diversification, all the heavy lifting. Eventually, you own your own properties, whether it's the home you live in, a vacation home, or ideally some rental properties. Maybe you're savvy enough to do things on spec and you can buy a property and flip it for 2x. I don't know. Maybe it's having permanent cash value life insurance, where it's not just a death benefit for the people you care about, but also an asset that grows regardless of what the markets are doing. Or you use that because you can no longer do a Roth IRA. You're maxed out at what you can put in your 401k. And by the way, you are accepting all the risk to grow that pile of money. And then the IRS, after you've taken all that risk, after you've grown the capital, says, okay, Scott, I'm ready for my share, right? So diversify your tax buckets, non-qualified Roth, life insurance cash values would still get FIFO treatment. The money I put in, I can get out first without having to pay tax. Thereafter, maybe policy loans. And we can talk about that broad. Again, as a CLU, I can work magic with permanent life insurance. We can talk about that. But that's 1 and 2. Learn to live on less than what you make. Do something smart with the difference. And again, I'm putting this out there because it's my business. You need to have somebody, an accountability partner that you trust, to help you do 1 and 2 better and better all the time. That's rule number 3. Hire someone you trust, who is not going to tell you what you want to hear, but what you need to hear, to make sure you're saving the right way, that you're saving yourself from maybe some of the pitfalls in capital markets or getting over your skis, who is going to look you in the eye when times are really cantankerous and say, Scott, it's okay, right? We planned for this. Everything is all right. Yes, this asset class is down 38% this year, but it's okay. In fact, you have some money in your opportunity fund. Let's deploy it, right? Let's get a discount on that asset class while it's still cheap, right? Stocks are the one thing that people wait until the sale is over before they start buying again. Right?
Yep.
So that's rules number 1, 2, and 3. Sounds pretty simple, but without number 3, it's hard to have somebody to help you do those things.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, and we'll be hypothetical, of course, because you can't give out financial advice to everybody on a podcast. But let's just say, theoretically, Scott Groves really got his hand slapped in 2008, 9, 10 when the market crashed. And let's say, hypothetically, he lost his entire 401k because, unbeknownst to me, maybe it was in Washington Mutual stock. It was miserable. Yeah. So I've been very hesitant, right? So I've missed out. Probably pick a number, 100 grand, 200 grand in an asset account. I've missed out on 4 years of growth because I'm just like, we've got to be at the top of the market. We've got to be at the top of the market. And to the credit of my financial planner, who's very similar to you, very well-versed in life insurance, he's like, hey man, you've got your safe bucket of cash value life insurance. You're doing all the right things. You should be deploying this money in the market. I'm like, nope. Not going to do it. Not going to do it. Not going to do it. So as you started out this podcast, I've created the cardinal, or I have committed the cardinal sin of keeping my money in cash too long. And then the problem is every day is now just a self-fulfilling prophecy of it. Like, well, if I was scared to put it in yesterday and now the market is higher, I should be more scared to put it in today because now we're just one step closer to a market correction or a cycle correction or whatnot. But then there's this opportunity to buy March of last year and the S&P hits, 1,700. Now it's back to 4,000, or maybe it hit 1,900 or something like that, somewhere around 2,000. And now it's back to not the S&P, the what am I thinking of? What went to like 2,000? Yeah, the NASDAQ was at like 2,000 last year. Now it's at 4,000. I don't know. Anyway, the point is that I've stayed in cash way too long. And now it's like, well, do I deploy now and just run headfirst into the beach, into the fire? Or do I just stay in cash for a long time because I'm like, well, I kind of missed out on 4 years, 5 years worth of gains. What's another year before things correct or there's a cyclical correction? And I don't know what to do.
So you do. In fact, you said this before in podcast number 3, you were talking about dollar cost averaging, right? And so instead of trying to time the market, especially when there are pockets of it that are heated right now, and we know that, whether we're if you look at precious metals, if you look at real estate, if you look at tech stocks or healthcare stocks, we could argue that some of those are hot. But even gold took a step backward, and I don't want to go into all the reasons why that may be the case. Where I would deploy a bunch of money right now, and a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about." Well, I love blockchain. I don't know if all of the forks around Bitcoin are going to be as profitable as the one that, the senator's cousin is going to put all of his or her money into. So be diversified. So you don't have to put it all in one thing, like the stock market. Diversify. Now you have ownership of various asset classes. You've done a good job with that. You're very good about plowing money back in your business. That's where you're going to see the most alpha, Scott, is right back in your business where you have the most control. But if you want to invest in capital markets, instead of owning WAMU, the stock, own Washington Mutual, the fund.
Yep.
Right. So there's a mutual fund that exists going back to the 60s. And what does it buy? Blue chip companies. It buys companies that pay dividends, like financial companies. Right. So yes, big banks and big energy have had a nice pop since the election, but they're still, relative to, if we look at growth companies, they still have a lot of room to run. And if you look at industrials, materials companies, consumer staples versus consumer discretionary, if you look at those sectors, they still have room to run. But the best thing is, if you're wrong, you get paid to wait, because the dividend rates are by far higher than what you get paid on cash. The worst thing about cash is not that you don't get paid much right now. That's pretty awful. But what's worse than that is you pay tax at ordinary income rates on that money instead of qualified dividends, which for a lot of people are only 15 or 20%, and or long-term capital gains, which again, for most people are 15 or 20%. Why pay ordinary income on the meager interest you earn at the bank, which is negligible?
Right.
Why not deploy some of that, a little bit every month, into a diversified portfolio of stuff that isn't just overheated right now or very hot? But even if you're wrong on the other stuff, you'll capture some months where the NASDAQ has had more bad days than good. We already had a correction on the NASDAQ. It's recovered since and gone back to 4,000. But we had that 10% drop from the highs on the NASDAQ already.
Yeah. Yeah, right? That's interesting.
If you want to keep it even simpler, instead of Washington Mutual, just buy diamonds. I don't mean diamond. Now, your wife is going to hate me for saying not those type of diamonds, but buy DIA, right? Buy the Dow 30 companies in one ETF, one exchange traded fund. It's one trade. Buy diamonds. A lot of people were buying cubes, QQQ before, right? So if you want to buy spiders, diamonds, you are going to own the market. I think going forward, I think the Dow 30 companies are probably going to do better than all 500 companies of the S&P if you look at risk versus reward and the fact that the Dow 30 companies have a stronger yield. In other words, if you're wrong on price, you'll get paid to wait.
And that
Dow, yield is going to be a lot.
The Dow 30, give me some idea of some of the companies that are in there.
So you have Chevron, you have ExxonMobil, you have Bank of America, you have Apple, you have companies that are huge companies, and they have to be in the Dow. But if you own 30 of them, if the oil is down that day, maybe some of your more tech-oriented companies or consumer staple companies will have a better day.
Got it.
Right? You're going to own Walmart and Bank of America and ExxonMobil instead of trying to pick which of those is the one to get in right now. You buy a little bit along the way and you say, okay, I've got $100,000 I want to deploy. The next 10 months, I'm going to put 10 grand to work. And, of that 10 grand, I'm going to put 2,000 into diamonds every time. And I'm going to buy those 30 companies, whether up, down, or sideways, but I'm going to deploy my capital over the next 10 months. If you want to be more conservative, the next 20. And the 100 isn't all of your cash. It's just your market-based capital that you want to deploy into a diversified capital gain type of non-qualified property.
Yeah.
I know that was a mouthful. I think you.
No, I think this is good stuff. It's if you've got $100,000 that's been sitting on the sidelines for a little too long and you've already lost the gains, $5,000 a month on the first of the month for the next 20 months, period, the end. Whether there's blood in the streets or the stock market's on fire, you're just going to dollar cost average in $5,000 a month on the first of the month for the next 20 months in some, reasonable companies. I'm not going to do $5,000 a month into GameStop, but $5,000 a month into some reasonable funds, low cost, like you mentioned, Spider, Index, Diamond, whatever the case may be. That's just kind of a good plan for success at any stage in a market cycle, it sounds like.
Exactly right.
Cool.
Remove the timing and emotion from that, because humans are bred to be careful, right? We are bred to be survivors. We do chase greed, but we feel pain twice as much as we feel gain, right? So knowing that, remove the emotion from the equation. Use your brain, not your gut and your heart. Use your brain to say, I know these strategies work over the long term. I know 10 years from now, I won't care what price I paid for ExxonMobil. I just know, I hope it'll be higher 10 years from now. But if I'm wrong, it was just one of the things I own.
Right. Right. And I want to have you on if you'll grace us with your presence for a whole nother conversation about Bitcoin and crypto and stuff, because you mentioned that, and that's interesting to me, but I don't claim to understand it. So that's a whole nother episode. But you did make a joke about the GameStop. Can you explain to the lay person what's been going on, and depending on what side of the aisle you kind of come from, this is either market manipulation, or this is individual investors run awry, or this is Robinhood turning a bunch of young men into stock market gamblers. There's so much messaging going on what happened. But can you explain to people what GameStop is and what happened that made it be part of the zeitgeist and part of the news over the last couple months?
Yeah, so GameStop, the company itself, is a retailer I think most people know of new and used video game equipment and actual software. So when you think about retail in general, and you think about video game retail, especially in an era where a lot of, whether it's you or your kids, can download via the internet a new game and stream that game, what chance does a brick and mortar retailer have, right, against the monoliths like Microsoft, okay, or Ubisoft or some of the other companies? Well, it turns out that old guys like me, especially who are into retro gaming, like going into a store and looking at all the new stuff and the old stuff. And I like going in there, and if I could get it, I would buy Outrun, Double Dragon, right, and Thunderstrike, and all of those old games that we used to love to play. Well, and now there are people popping up to do some of that, but that's so retail, brick and mortar retail was the main thing that was the headwind for GameStop. But a bunch of people, tech savvy people, got into a Reddit group, and they decided, all right, the same way that all of the guys who went to Yale and they have 4 different hedge funds and they all decide to bid up a stock, they're going to go into a name, into a company that is trading at, for example, $3.60 a share. And we, with our capital that we can deploy in this fund, can start putting millions and millions and millions of dollars into the stock, thereby driving the price up. And then when other people catch the fact that we've now moved the stock from $3.60 a share to $14.60 a share, that's when we exit. So we bought it at $3.60. Maybe we paid as much as $8 a share on the way up. Then we let the rubes take over. And now the market is moving into the name. And now I can unwind all those shares I bought at $3 to $8 on the people that are willing to pay $14, $15, $28 a share. So a bunch of Reddit guys said, well, instead of just having Wall Street do that to us, let's do it to Wall Street, right? Let's all get together, and as a collective, we're going to start bidding up the stock. And then it worked so well for a couple of reasons, but it worked so well that the market really started to pay attention on the other side, and then the news took hold of it. But one of the reasons is because we had what's called a short squeeze. So those hedge funds, those same guys that all went to Yale and Harvard together and have bigger, more expensive brains than you and I put together, those people actually looked at the headwind facing GameStop and said, there's no way this company is going to do well. I am going to short the stock, meaning I think the price is going to go down in the future. So I am going to buy the stock at 26 cents a share right? And I will take profit today on the 360 share that it is. Well, unfortunately, the opposite happened. A bunch of people started bidding it up. Then it got into hundreds of dollars a share, whatever it was. And now I have a short squeeze. I have to buy the stock back because the options that I bought have an expiration date. So at some point, I have to buy the stock that I shorted, but instead of paying pennies per share, I have to pay hundreds of dollars per share. And that's called a short squeeze. So because they had to buy the stock, they themselves are exacerbating their own problem and bidding the stock up further than all the guys who got into it. So hopefully that makes some sense to give you an idea of what was going on.
So let me repeat this back to you and see if I understand it. And we'll pretend that Erin is the savvy internet troll on Reddit, and we'll pretend Scott is the obnoxious hedge fund owner, who went to Yale and has all the connections. So Scott Groves looks at, and I'm just going to use round numbers because I don't know what the actual dollars were. Scott Groves looks at GameStop. And I come to the hedge fund. I say, look, guys, retail is taking a bath because of COVID. Video games are more and more going to a downloadable situation. And this kind of antiquated brand, GameStop, it's currently trading, again, I'm going to use round numbers, $10 a share. We think it's going to be bankrupt and worthless within a year. So let's go in and however these financial instruments work, us as the hedge fund, let's make a bet that this stock is going to be worth 50 cents in a year because GameStop is not going to exist and they're going to cease to be a viable company. They're going to go bankrupt. Well, then Erin and all of his buddies on Reddit who say, no, we love going into a video game store. Fuck these hedge fund guys. We don't want them to drive down the price of GameStop and prematurely put them out of business. They might go out of business, but not on our watch. So all the Reddit guys get together and they start buying the stock. So then it goes from $10 to $11 to $12 to $13. This gets out of control. Now all of a sudden GameStop is $100 and the hedge fund looks and says, oh my God, we bet wrong. We've got to cover our position where we bought the stock for 50 cents. So now we got to buy it at $100. But now that I'm buying it at $100, it's going up to 120. So then the Reddit guys go, well, we're getting rich because our stock went to 120. Let's buy it at 140. And then it just becomes this self-fulfilling perpetual motion machine where the stock goes from $10 to $400. And then who gets caught holding the bag? Because the hedge fund obviously got screwed. And there's now some epic stories of these hedge funds having to go to Big Brother hedge fund to borrow money just to keep them solvent. But when everybody comes back to reality and says, well, maybe GameStop will make it, maybe they won't, the stock's really worth the $10 it was originally worth before we started playing this game, who gets caught holding the bag?
So ultimately, the end stock consumer loses. So ultimately, you have the people who just want to get the shenanigans out of the way of buying a company I want to own for the next 20 years. That's ultimately who pays the price, because what happens, I can no longer buy. I can only sell. So maybe I don't want to sell. Maybe I want to own this company longer, but you also have all these people who had paper gains, right, in the 10,000% range. But if it all gets wiped away and you're back to where you started, well, it may have been a fun ride, but you never really made any money. But maybe you had to brag that at one point you had 10,000 shares of GameStop that was worth millions of dollars and is now worth, again, a few dollars a share. So ultimately, who loses is the market itself and the participants in the market when these shenanigans go on. So now, again, I would lean more towards the side of the people who actually love GameStop and don't want to see a company like that go out of business because all of this is happening to manipulate the share price behind the scenes.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, this stuff has been going on for decades, if not 100 years. I remember reading this in some history class that one of the families, I won't even say one of the large families in America, I'll get it wrong, so I won't mention it. Maybe it was the Kennedys. I don't know. They were famous for painting the tape. So you and we would pick a stock, you would bid it up, I would bid it up, you would bid it up. And it was called painting the tape because the old stock market ticker tape would start rising. Other people would be like, oh man, somebody knows something I don't know. I better buy that stock too. And then you and I would sell at the end of the day. We'd make a nice little profit. I mean, this has been going on since the beginning of the stock market.
Right.
But it is interesting how when the smart Yale, Harvard people from the hedge fund do it, it's normal course of business. When the trolls living in their mom's basement on Reddit did it, all of a sudden it's like, well, Robinhood is evil. There should be restrictions on this stuff. And, maybe we need government legislation to protect people from themselves. It's like, I don't think we need any of that. If somebody wants to play that game and they lose $10,000 in GameStop stock, oh, well, maybe they won't do it again. Or maybe they'll make $10,000 and they'll stick it to the man. Like, it's weird that all of a sudden when the little guy was winning, that then became this protectionist environment of like, oh, we should probably write some regulations and maybe Robinhood is evil and the SEC should look into this because some little guys can't get rich.
Well, and I think you had a lot of tourists in the market who were new to it, and they had that tailwind, and they thought maybe through hubris that they were responsible for boosting the market, and they were in some way. But then when they're told that Robinhood by its name is a way to steal from the rich and give to the poor, well, maybe that's not exactly how it works when you realize who owns Robinhood. And that when you're told it's commission free, you think, oh, they're blessing it. It's good for us little guys. Well, not in every instance, but I remember one client, we'll call him Al. And I remember I was helping him on the insurance side because he managed his own portfolio, but he also managed to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars when the tech bubble burst because he was so right in the late 90s and you could throw darts at a board and win. He is still convinced that they pricked the asset bubble. And when technology burst, it wasn't because these companies' fundamentals weren't keeping up with stock prices. It's because too many people were getting rich. And so the rich wanted to make sure that enough people were poor again and had to work.
Interesting concept. I
don't know.
Maybe
there's a little something to that.
Maybe there's a little something to that.
Can't convince Al otherwise.
Yeah. Maybe there's a little something to that. But, when Pets.com was losing $1 for every dollar it was making, maybe that was a business model that wasn't going to make it in the long run. Last parting thoughts as we record this April in 2021. Do you have any predictions for the market, thoughts about the market? We're going to have you on to talk a whole nother political show because I have the feeling you and I, if we both enjoy arguing with Mike, we're probably more politically aligned than I thought. But when it comes to the market, finances, interest rates, the next $10 trillion infrastructure bailout that they're thinking about now, what are your thoughts for the next year or two in the markets?
Like you, I'm concerned that capital markets are so dependent, like the middle class now, on government stimulus. And I think that eventually is going to come to a head. I think in the meantime, I say what I tell a lot of my clients: if you can't beat them, join them. So these companies, ultimately, I'm going to bring it back full circle. These companies, most of the ones that survived through COVID, especially the big public companies, are as profitable, if not more so than ever. So there is some fundamentals behind some of these stock prices. But when you see both gold and financials and oil move all in the same direction on a given trading day, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But what you saw is some rotation. So I'm just not going to get too technical here, but there are value companies like I described before, financials, energy, materials that tend not to have huge price fluctuation, but tend to reward their shareholders in dividends. Those have trailed going all the way back to the Great Recession relative to the growth companies where I'm buying shares of this company and it's the early Amazon or the early Microsoft. They don't really generate a lot of shareholder returns. The way they reward their shareholders is you're betting on this company going from $10 a share to 100 or 200 someday. I think growth relative to value is a little bit ahead of itself. So we'll see days where the Dow, depending on the news, is going to do a lot better than the NASDAQ. Again, we've already had a correction in the NASDAQ. And since then, when Powell decided to leave rates at zero, we saw the market recover very quickly. I think eventually one of the things that's going to happen is that rotation out of these PE multiples being very high to the companies that are rewarding their shareholders via dividends and sustainable earnings. So when that happens, how it happens, the magnitude of how it happens, let's hope it happens in a smooth way. But I'm not betting the farm on that being smooth. So again, diversification. If you're going to own some gold, 5% of a portfolio is great. If you want precious metals and commodities, 10% of a portfolio as a diversifier is great. Real estate, if you think that you have proven that you have a track record flipping properties and being profitable, not getting too over your skis, then by all means. But I would recommend for most people in their market-based portfolio, they have a real estate investment trust, and it's no more, again, than 5 to 10% of their portfolio. So be diversified. Own value, own a little bit of growth. I think value is going to be a better place than growth over the next 2 to 3 years. Own small caps and large stack. Own the smaller, nimble companies that may respond to the recovery a little bit more quickly than, say, the big behemoths like an aircraft carrier that takes forever to turn around. You want to buy the little skippers. And then if we look at international versus domestic, domestic has done so well. We are among the developed nations. We are probably the safest house in an increasingly demographically challenged neighborhood. But you do still want to own the companies that are, regardless of where they're domiciled, or going to participate in the recovery, the global recovery. So I'm always a glass half full kind of guy, right? So you have the optimist who sees the glass as half full. You have the pessimist who sees it as empty. And the engineer says, well, the glass is just too big. So I think you have to take I do have the brain of an engineer and the soul of a teacher. So I love explaining this stuff, but I can bring it down to a very technical level, but I also want to make sure that you understand trying to time the markets or employing emotion, whether that's greed or fear, is never a sustainable strategy. So owning markets over the long term and big chunks and different pieces of different asset classes, if you're not diversified yet, by all means, use opportunities over the next 2 to 3 years to get diversified, and be willing to close your eyes and take your balls out of your wife's purse and maybe deploy some capital in the markets when things get really hairy. Okay.
I love it.
Often your wife is probably the one who's going to spur you, say, Scott, come on, we got too much cash. It's time to buy that place in Cabo, right? Let's do it.
I hope that's the case one day, that I have enough cash to buy a place in Cabo. But I appreciate you having on. And when they announce the next $2 trillion worth of stimulus, or the $10 billion or $10 billion, billion's not even a word anymore, the $10 trillion infrastructure plan, we'll have you back on to talk about that. And I really appreciate your time, Erin.
Yeah. Glad to do it.
Cool, man.
It's been a pleasure, Scott.
We'll talk to you soon, sir.
I'll bid you adieu. Have a good Friday and a happy Easter weekend.
Thanks, man. Talk to you soon.